Hi, this is Eternal King here coming at you with another LOR video today. Yesterday we basically polished off how to aggro. We talked about all the top aggro decks in the format. There are 4 codes, deck codes in that video that you can use to start climbing day 1 when ranked Eternal unlocks in December that will suit your purposes pretty well. So what's the polar opposite of aggro? Well, the answer is control. So let's look at all the top control decks in the format, talk about what it is about them that makes them relatively strong, and the things that you need to watch out for when you're playing against them. So in terms of top control decks, you can't really talk about control without talking about Nora Swain. The thing that Nora Swain does so well that we've covered on the channel before is that it has cheap pings. So pings are good into aggro, but then it also has cheap hard removal. So the fact that you can essentially deal 5 damage to something for 2 mana is the top of the format in terms of cost-effective removal. There is no removal in the format that does 5 damage for 2 mana. Yes, it requires 2 cards, but assuming that you don't care as much about, you're more concerned about tempo and anti-tempo, which is what a control deck does, you're kind of willing to take the loss on the 2 cards. And to be fair, Pytos cycles. So it's not really, it's kind of like 1.5 cards. And then you get to flock something for 2 mana. So 5 damage for 2 mana and 1.5 cards is format defining in terms of efficiency, which is the bedrock of why this deck is so good. Obviously, strong cycle tools like Conchologist, manifesting a spell that costs 3 or less, which means that more often than not, Conchologist will essentially RNG into an additional ping, which is more pings for the deck, which is what you want for a control deck. Disintegrate being the best, being the other best in class removal, hard removal, so 2 mana to permanently kill something is best in class for the format. So as long as you stack it correctly, you can spend 1 mana for a Pytos, 2 mana for a Disintegrate, and you'll kill anything in the game. Again, potentially costing you 1.5 cards, but again, it is 3 mana less than a Vengeance. So it is best in class removal, which was why Nora Swain is one of the best control decks in the format. Drop the Bomb, it's just a Mystic Shot. That's literally why it's in this deck. But it is region-appropriate Mystic Shot, so that's good. Junk Construct, again, is a cycle tool, similar to Conchologist, but it is a creature cycler instead of a spell cycler. Only difference there. Nora is a creature cycler, shuffles in portals into your deck. Pokestick, obviously I love this card. It's great in an aggro shell, like Ziggs Vex. It's also great in a control shell, like Nora Swain. It is one of the best pings in the game. Simply because you spend 2 mana, you deal 1 damage to something, and it cycles. In terms of other cards, Scorched Earth, kill a damaged unit or destroy a landmark. Obviously, it's more hard removal in the deck where you want hard removal. Whether it is a landmark win con, something like Emp Army, for example, or it is, you can just like snap this onto an Emp Army the moment the Azir Aurelia player plays it, so that's really good for that, or you can use it in a creature-based matchup as well. My special spice is I added Kashuri Swipe. I don't mind it. It is either a 3 mana Mystic Shot or it is more hard removal for the deck. It's very flexible. I like it. Now, if you want to know what normally goes in this deck, it is typically Stun, which I don't value that highly. I don't value the Wallop that highly, and then 1 counter spell. In the highest levels of competitive LOR, there are very few spell-based win cons right now. The biggest, scariest decks are typically creature-based win cons, but yeah, if you want the 1 Wallop and then the 1 Puzzle Signpost, go for it. It's just preference. If you want more creature-based hard removal, or if you think that this is going to get you there, then go for that. Portapalooza, obviously it's draw, it's a cycler, and it's more creature-based cycling. That's what Portapalooza is. Swain turbo levels very easily in this deck. There's very few instances where Swain is coming down not leveled, just thanks to all the pings and all the flocks. You're very likely to have Swain coming down leveled. And Rage Fire Spitter, of course, is a 6 mana unit that is very, very good. It reminds me of a card from Magic the Gathering, which was a 5 mana card that essentially allowed you to swing and remove something in the same turn. And this kind of does the same thing. It comes down, it removes something, and then you swing and you remove something, which is, it'll basically at the stat line of 6/4, you know, it pings something small, drags something big, and that's very efficient for a Swain deck. And then Leviathan coming down, and it's your Swain boat, gives you more Swains, stuns the board, etc. So obviously this is one of the best control decks in the game. There's 2 flex slots here, so feel free to put in whatever you want for those 2 flex slots, but the rest of this deck is mandatory. You don't change anything else in this deck other than the 2 flex slots. So that is the best spell-based control deck in the game. Period, full stop. If things like Flock and Disintegrate were standard legal, it would dominate standard. Now, because they're eternal legal, Swain will always be a 60% win rate control deck in the format for the rest of time. Built by Maj and Bay, it is a format representative. It is foundational for LOR as a card game. Talking about the next top control deck, it is going to be Nasus. So the way that Nasus works, if you don't know, is you essentially play creature heavy early on, and then you get to play a 10/10 Nasus for 6 mana. So what it means is that you don't really care about any of your creatures. Again, this deck is full of flex slots. I would argue that something like Nasus Thresh is a flex slot deck. Everything is optional other than Thresh and Nasus, and it's just about what you want to do to be the most successful at building your deck. Bakai Reaper is a nice 1-drop. When you slay a unit, grant me 1/0. So when your units are dying, your Bakai Reaper is getting bigger. So I would say like that's probably pretty important. Ravenous Butcher, allowing you to kill off your cursed keepers, that's pretty important. Wings in the Wave, doing the same thing. Fading Icon, going too wide like a House Spider, but with a different stat distribution, it's pretty good. And then you have your spells. Usually Glimpse is mandatory for a Slay deck because it just lets you turn all your junky units into draw. You know, and the rest of this is just like how do you want to ratio out your spells. Vile Feast is a 2-of, you know, it's a nice ping and a chumper. Soul Harvest, you know, is a nice Culling Strike in Shadow Isles. Hate Spike, turning one of your little, you know, junky units into hard removal is nice. The same thing with Death's Grasp, and it's just a question of like what you think is going to make the deck the most effective for the way that you want to play it. It's all flex. Everything about Thresh Nasus is flex. Don't feel like this list in particular is going to be necessarily better than your Thresh Nasus list. Maybe you want to go harder on the board clears. Maybe you want to go harder on the pings. Maybe you want to go harder on the Soul Harvests. Maybe you want to go harder on the Hate Spikes and the Death's Grasps. It's really just up to you. Maybe you want to go harder on the creature spam, right? It is up to you. So Thresh Nasus is just a flex deck that only has really 2 things that are mandatory, which is creature spam and then whatever the optimal amount of spell-based reactionary you know, inclusions are. And then obviously Thresh and Nasus itself. But this has objectively been the second best control deck in the duration of LOR as a card game. It is an enduring deck. It lasts forever, similar to Nora Swain. It's just that the tech and the ratioing is constantly changing, unlike Nora Swain, which is basically locked in other than 2 slots. Talking about the you know, third best control deck in the game, it is going to be Eddy. You can't really get around Eddy. The thing that I like about this Eddy list specifically versus other Eddy lists is that it is on triple Tavern Keeper, triple Pioneer. We've talked a lot about how the only difference between a good Eddy deck and a bad Eddy deck is how effectively it stalls into its matron spam, and running a full 3 of both Tavern Keeper and Scholarly Pioneer, and even the likes of Lysandra, basically says that I want to stall on 3, and then also Troll Scavenger saying I want to stall a little bit on 2 as well. It's all stall, right? This is all just like a lot of junk to force the opponent to get through, right? It's a lot of healing, it's a lot of stall, it's a lot of creature chumpers and blockers that are tough to get through. Now, we do have some reactionary plays, so 2 of Avalanche. You probably don't need more than 2 when you're on triple Tavern Keeper, triple Pioneer, because that's a lot of healing and a lot of stall already. So yeah, two board clears is fine. Then we can talk about the ramp selection. It is Wild Mysticism, 1 Winter's Touch. So the one thing that you could say about this deck is that it's a little light on the ramp, but it has Cloud Drake, right? So you only really need to hit ramp once to slam Cloud Drake, and then Cloud Drake is going to do the OP Cloud Drake thing. I've talked about this card countless times. Cloud Drake is one of the best cards in the game, objectively speaking, because it's universal creature ramp. It does not say, when I'm summoned, reduce the cost of all dragons in hand. It says, when I'm summoned, reduce the cost of all allied units in hand. So there are very few decks that do not benefit from the one of Elder Dragon splash, plus, 3 Cloud Drakes. There's very few decks that don't benefit from that because it's such a universal power play. Talking about what the core combo, it is Matron spam, right? So you play Spectral Matron into Heisho, Spectral Matron into Heisho, then Cithria. So typically your top end looks like Cithria, Heisho, and then Spectral Matron, and that's basically mandatory. The rest is just tech and stall in terms of your optimal, Eddy deck. But in terms of the win rate, if you just want like highest win rate Eddy, 3 Pioneers, 3 Tavern Keepers, 3 Cloud Drakes, and then Spectral Matron spam, Cithria, and Heisho. And like that's just how, top Eddy works. The rest is up to you. It's a very simple deck, and it's one that I don't like to play. I have never played Eddy before, but I have to talk about it because it is one of the top Eternal decks in the game. Talking about Temple, being the other top control deck in the game, you can play Temple really 2 ways. There is TF Nilla Temple, and then there is Seraphine Temple. The thing about Seraphine Temple is it's going to be a lot of one-offs. A lot of one-offs that don't accumulate a ton of value on their own, but then once Seraphine turbo levels, she starts doing crazy RNG stuff that wins her the game. Again, Temple, it basically, without Temple, I don't think Seraphine works in Eternal specifically. Seraphine it basically needs the draw off a Temple to get to all of her, low value cheap plays to turbo flip her. And then obviously Ezreal giving you some burn win con, where once Ezreal is flipped after you've targeted a million things with a million pings, then you can burn the opponent out. And then Janna just being an updraft 4-mana play that you play once. There's only 1 Janna in the deck. If you want, you could drop the Janna, 3 Ezreals. I don't think that's going to make a big difference either way. And also, like, having more like song spinners might be nice. It's really up to you. But the only things that really define a Seraphine Temple deck are Temple, Seraphine, Ezreal, and then a crap ton of pings and creature-based cycling. And that's the only thing that really defines a Seraphine Temple deck. Also one of the best decks in the game. Now, when it comes to traditional TF Temple, also being the 5th best control deck in the game, there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to traditional TF Temple. I personally like to run mine heavy. I like Hex Obliterator. Rocket Barrage is actually pretty standard, surprisingly, for TF Temple. A lot of people run Rocket Barrage in TF Temple. Whether it is in Standard or whether it is in Eternal, that's actually pretty common now, surprisingly. Hex Obliterator, not so much, but that's just tech for me. Cloud Winder, not so much, but I like to run it more as a mid-range deck because I have Candlelit Prayer. Typically, you wouldn't run all these heavy cards in TF because they would just chump up your hand, or they would just clump up your hand. But with the inclusion of the new story card, I'm pretty happy to just updraft heavy things out of my hand, pretty consistently. Very consistently, you can just updraft all these heavy cards, throw them back into the deck, slam Temple, draw them again, cycle them, updraft them back out, and also things like Soaring Cartographer, giving you much more control over your hand state, thanks to even more additional updraft flexibility. A little bit of a high skill card. Both of these are high skill for Temple, Cartographer and Prayer, but they're both very good if you're willing to run heavy Temple. But traditionally, it's more light. You'd be running cards like, the Do Nothing 1/2 in PNZ. Bilgewater. So you would traditionally be running Pool Shark, right, as just like a free cheap cycler. But then if you run Pool Shark, you can't run Heavy Temple. You have to run Light Temple. So more light cards, less of the high value top end stuff. But yeah, this is, kind of traditional TF Temple, Anilla Temple in a lot of ways. Certain things you'll always see. So the 3 Mystic Shots are mandatory. The 3 Gotchas will always be in the deck. The 3 Caretakers will always be in the deck. And 3 TFs will always be in the deck. And then the 3 Rocket Barrages are now standard. 3 Ruined Rexes are typical. 3 Exuberance are typical. And then 3 Temples are typical. And then you, again, have the tech or the flex slots in terms of how you want to run the deck. Usually people want to play less into denies, but denies are not that common. Thresh Nasus will run 2 denies, otherwise you will not see denies, because spell-based win cons or heavy costed spells just aren't common in the format. So you can actually feel kind of safe using them for that reason. And those are like the 5 best control decks in the game. But that doesn't mean that's all you have to run in terms of control. Talking more generally about the right and wrong ways to play control decks, you have things like Go Hard. So this is one of the newer control decks that I saw in the format. It was Flash Bomb control. Not competitive, but I did upgrade it to be slightly more competitive. It still struggles in a lot of ways. But there are things I like about it. Teemo Go Hard, it's kind of nice having this combination of cards, this exact combination of 1-drops. You play Teemo actively, you play Go Hard reactively. Cycler, 2-mana Cycler, right? Mushroom Cloud, Divine Draft to ping some things, Mystic Shot. I like 1 Divine Draft in a lot of my control decks. It just feels relatively high value as a one-off. You just need to ping 2 things for 2 mana, it's actually not bad. Not bad at all. Caitlyn on 3, of course, a real power play, and then you have your typical sort of Shrooms, Flash Bomb value stuff. You play Peacemaker as an overcosted Mystic Shot that cycles in Flash Bombs. You play things like Insider Knowledge to draw. You play things like Hexcore Foundry to draw. You play Puffcap Peddler to turn all your spells and all your Shrooms into higher value. You play Chump Wump, of course, to get you Shrooms, and then the more common inclusion these days is also Fishmonger. Fishmonger was a new card that does all the same things that Insider Knowledge and Hexcore Foundry does, but it does it on a 4/4 body, which is slightly hard to remove. Then you have Karina to kill your opponent, and then Vengeance is your hard removal option. So this gives you a sense of like the optimal ways to build off-meta control. I like to talk about the meta decks, and I talked about the top 5 meta control decks for Eternal. I also want to talk about how do you build off-meta control. Well, the way that you do it is by following similar principles. You include pings, right? Go Hard, Mystic Shot, or Pie Toss, Mystic Shot, or whatever it is that's in your region. You run your 2-mana Cycler, that's pretty much mandatory. You run like a high value control 3-drop, so in this case it's Caitlyn. And then, everything else is usually just like turbo win con stuff for your control deck. Temple, or in this case, using... This nice thing about this deck is that it's not a temple deck. It functions similarly to a temple deck in the sense that it's drawing you cards off of a landmark and off of a creature or off of a spell. So like, there's a lot of draw in it, there's a lot of pings in it, there's a lot of cycle power in it. But it's not meta. Temple is better. Temple decks are simply better than what this deck is doing, but it's off meta, and that's kind of the nice thing about it. So we can cover that one off meta deck as well. But that's kind of how control functions for Eternal as a format. Once again, I will include all of the 5 major deck codes that are well known for the format that you can use to climb day 1 in December once Eternal Ladder launches. Also worth considering is, of course, Jace. Right, Jace Lux, right now, not putting out stats. There is no version of Jace Lux currently that is putting out major stats, but that doesn't mean that it's not going to come back, right? So Jace Lux is also one to look out for. As a control deck or a nice mid-range control deck, never count it out entirely, because again, it's fairly flexible in terms of what you want to put in it, and all it takes is that one person to crack that perfect Jace Lux list to have it back next season. Just because there isn't currently, and like I won't actually share this list because I'm confident this isn't it, because I haven't figured out what it is yet. But there is a version of Jace Lux that is optimal, and keep an eye out for that next season if someone can crack that code. And yeah, that's it. Those are all the major control decks. Control has a much bigger, I'm going to use the term market share, or in this case, a meta representation in LOR, than it does in Standard. In Standard, control decks don't really exist. You essentially just have ramp, and that's it. Well, in this case, you have ramp, you have, you have Atrocity Nasus, but yes, you have your ramp, then you have your sort of landmark control, your creature-based, ping-heavy control, and then, again, more temple, basically. This is Eternal King, signing out.